Imagine losing everything you love. Eleanor's husband passed away, leaving her their flower shop. A business on the brink. She didn't know a single bouquet could change everything. Discover the secret that saved her shop and her heart. Who agrees to ruin a stranger's date for $15? Fina Chorus told herself it was harmless. Just a quick distraction so a woman she barely knew could walk away without looking bad. $15 meant groceries for tomorrow, maybe bus fare for the week. She never expected that the man she was paid to sabotage was Eric Baffer, a CEO millionaire with a gaze that saw straight through her defenses. One awkward evening turned into an unexpected connection, but when the truth about that night came out, it would test not only their trust, but the fragile possibility of something real between two people from opposite worlds. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The rain had already soaked through Fina Chorus' worn sneakers by the time she reached the back entrance of La Veranda. She paused beneath the dripping awning, breathing into her cold fingers and silently reminding herself that this was supposed to be quick, harmless, and worth the $15 in her coat pocket. $15 barely enough to buy groceries for a day, but enough to cover breakfast for her mother and sister tomorrow morning. Enough for bus fare to her shift at the cafe, maybe even a cup of cheap coffee to keep her awake between her evening deliveries. In her world, $15 mattered. It was Maya's idea. Maya, with her perfect hair and biting laugh, had been Fina's classmate back in high school. The kind of girl who floated above the rest of them, collecting attention like it was a currency she could never run out of. They hadn't spoken in months until earlier that afternoon when Mia's number lit up Fina's phone. "I've got a little favor," Maya had said in that airy tone that always sounded like she was humoring someone. "I've got this date tonight and I need an excuse to leave without looking like the bad guy." The guy's loaded, but also a complete narcissist. "I don't want to sit through 3 courses of him talking about himself. So you show up, stir the pot a bit, and I have a reason to walk out. I'll slip you $15 for your trouble." Fina had laughed at first, but Maya wasn't joking. "You're seriously asking me to crash your date?" "Not crash, just disrupt. Make it awkward." "You're good at that." It wasn't flattering. It also wasn't the worst job she'd been offered compared to cleaning up after strangers at the cafe or running hot food through icy streets for the delivery app. This sounded almost absurdly easy. She told herself no one would be hurt. Maya would get her exit. The guy would go back to whatever shiny world he lived in. And Fina would have $15 more than she'd had that morning. Now, standing outside the back door of the restaurant, she felt the first sliver of doubt. She wasn't dressed for La Veranda, not in her thrift store sweater and faded jeans, her hair escaping the knot she tied it in. But that was part of Maya's plan. The more out of place she looked, the better the embarrassment. She slipped in through the side entrance, skirting around waiters balancing trays of wine glasses. The soft hum of jazz and the low murmur of conversation spilled from the dining room. She spotted Maya almost immediately sitting at a corner table with a man whose profile was all sharp lines and calm stillness. He was dressed in a dark suit that looked like it had been tailored to him and no one else. His posture relaxed but contained, like someone used to being watched. Maya caught sight of Fina and smiled just a little, the signal time to play the part. Fina waited until a waiter passed before accidentally bumping into the corner of their table, sloshing the water jug just enough to splash droplets near the man's plate. "Oh, I'm so sorry," she said quickly, dabbing at the table with a napkin. The man, Eric Baylor, though she didn't know his name yet, looked up at her. His eyes weren't cold, but they were assessing the kind of gaze that took in details and filed them away. "It's fine," he said, his voice low and even. Maya made a show of sighing, glancing at her watch and muttering something about bad luck following me. Fina moved to a nearby empty table, ordered a coffee she had no intention of drinking, and made a few light, unnecessary comments toward their table whenever the opportunity arose. She wasn't cruel, just intrusive enough to keep the conversation from finding a rhythm. After 10 minutes, Maya excused herself, leaning in toward Eric with a faux apologetic smile. "I'm sorry. This isn't working." And then she was gone, leaving behind half a glass of wine and a faint cloud of expensive perfume. Fina watched her go, relieved it was over, until Eric turned toward her table. "You look like you're waiting for someone," he said. She blinked. "Not really. Then maybe you'd consider joining me. I'd rather not finish this evening alone." Her first instinct was to refuse, to slip out before things got complicated. But something in his tone, not demanding, not wounded, just curious, made her hesitate. Against her better judgment, she moved to the empty seat across from him. They talked at first about nothing, the weather, the music, the absurdity of the dessert prices. She found herself laughing, and to her surprise, he did too. His smile was different from his composed expression earlier, warmer, less practiced. When the waiter cleared their plates, Eric reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, setting it on the table between them. "I think," he said lightly, "it would be unfair if I let you leave without giving me a chance to return the favor of saving my evening coffee sometime." "I didn't really say that," she said, half smiling. "Humor me," he replied, sliding the phone a little closer. She hesitated, then took it. typing in her number. When she handed it back, she tilted her head. Fair's fair. Give me yours in case I need to complain about the coffee. He dictated the digits and she saved them under Eric Lavanda, the name feeling oddly solid in her phone. As they stood to leave, he helped her into her coat. A gesture so casual and unallocated it caught her off guard. Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle, the street lamps painting the wet pavement gold. Good night, Fina, he said, as if he'd known her name for years instead of 20 minutes. She walked away, telling herself she wouldn't hear from him again. And yet, as she turned the corner, she realized she was still smiling. Fina didn't expect to hear from him. In her experience, conversations that started out of chance and curiosity tended to fade into nothing, especially when the two people involved lived in different worlds. She was used to moments that felt like they mattered and then vanished by the next day. But the next morning, in between wiping down tables at the cafe and delivering a plate of pancakes to an elderly couple, her phone buzzed. Eric Lavanda, you made it home without bumping into any more tables. I hope. She stared at the screen for a beat, the corners of her mouth twitching upward before she could stop herself. Her thumbs hovered for a moment before she typed back, I managed. No tables were harmed. The reply came almost instantly. Coffee, this time without sabotage. She hesitated. $15 might have brought her to his table last night. But there was no reason to keep seeing him, no reason except the pull she felt. The way he'd looked at her like he was interested in the answer, not just the conversation. An hour later, she was sitting across from him at a small bakery 2 blocks from the cafe. The morning rush had died down, leaving the place warm and smelling faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread. Eric looked different in daylight, less polished, more human. The suit had been traded for a dark sweater and a jacket that still looked expensive but didn't scream for attention. You work close by? He asked after the first sip of his coffee. Couple of streets over, she said. You a few more than a couple. He smirked faintly, leaving it at that. They talked about small things first. How the rain seemed endless this week, the best places to get bread that didn't taste like cardboard, the neighborhood's habit of decorating too early for the holidays. But the longer they talked, the more it shifted. She told him about her mother's bad knee, about her younger sister who still believed in magic despite everything. She didn't mention the $15 or Maya, she wasn't ready for that. He told her he ran a company, his voice careful, almost evasive. When she asked what kind, he said, the kind that keeps you in meetings until you forget what month it is. It was said with a dry humor that made her laugh, but something in his tone made her wonder what he wasn't telling her. They lingered longer than either had planned. At one point, she glanced at the clock on the wall and realized she was 5 minutes late to her delivery shift. She scrambled for her bag, but Eric reached across the table, resting his hand over hers for just a second. Let me walk you out, he said. Outside, the air was crisp, the clouds breaking just enough to let sunlight spill between the buildings. They paused at the corner where their paths split. I'd like to see you again, he said, somewhere that isn't an accident. You're assuming that wasn't an accident? She teased. Was it? Her smile was small but real. Maybe not entirely. They exchanged a look that felt heavier than the words, then went their separate ways. Over the next week, their texts and brief calls became a thread in Fina's days. Something quiet but steady, like the hum of the Aves' old espresso machine. She didn't tell her mother about him, and she definitely didn't tell Maya. By Thursday, he asked her to meet him again. This time, it wasn't at a cafe. He sent an address and simply wrote, trust me. The building was older, brick with faded lettering above the door that suggested it had once been a factory. Inside, the air smelled faintly of turpentine and wood shavings. The space opened into a large, light-filled room scattered with easels, paintbrushes, and canvases in every stage of completion. A community art studio, Eric said when she stepped inside, her eyes darting from one colorful piece to another. Funded anonymously, no fees. People come here to breathe a little. She touched the edge of a half-finished canvas, her fingertips coming away with the faintest trace of blue paint. And you brought me here. Why? Because you told me you used to paint, he said simply. Fina looked at him, caught between suspicion and a warmth she couldn't quite hide. That was a long time ago. Then it's overdue. For the next hour, she stood at an easel, her hands finding their old rhythm almost without thinking. He stayed nearby but didn't hover, occasionally sipping coffee and watching her with the kind of focus that made her pulse flicker. When she finally set down the brush, there was color smeared across her fingers and a lightness in her chest she hadn't felt in months. Not bad for someone who hasn't touched a brush in a year, he said. She smiled, but her voice was quiet. It's more than not bad. I needed this. Felt like the start of something. She didn't know how quickly it would begin to unravel. It happened on a Monday. The weekend had been quiet. The kind of quiet that felt like it was theirs alone, even if they hadn't seen each other in person. A few texts here and there. A short call where he asked about her delivery shifts, and she'd laughed about the strange customers she'd met. Nothing grand, nothing dramatic, just easy. By mid-afternoon, Fina was halfway through stacking clean mugs on the cafe shelves when her phone buzzed again. She didn't check it right away. She had a delivery coming up. And the manager hated when she got distracted, but when she finally glanced at the screen, her stomach tightened. It wasn't from Eric. It was a notification from one of those gossip news apps she never read but had never deleted. The headline was in bold, screaming for attention. Who is the mystery woman with Eric Baffer? Fina stared, her breath snagging. Beneath the headline was a blurry, zoomed-in photo. The two of them walking out of the art studio on Saturday. Her scarf pulled up against the cold, his head tilted toward her like she just said something worth hearing. Her first thought wasn't even about herself, it was about him. About the fact that this was the first time she'd seen his full name in print. She'd suspected he was wealthy, yes, but she hadn't known he was this. The kind of person who made headlines for simply walking down a street. The kind of person who lived under the constant watch of strangers with cameras. Her second thought was of Maya. Before she could stop herself, she scrolled down to the comments. They were worse than the headline. Wild guesses, snide remarks, people dissecting her clothes, her hair, her worth. Some wondered if she was a secret ace. Others dismissed her as a gold digger. None of them were close to the truth. By the time she looked up, her hands were trembling. She shoved the phone into her pocket and forced herself to finish her shift. Eric saw the article, too. He was in a meeting when Lydia, his assistant, slid her phone across the polished conference table. Thought you'd want to see this before it gets forwarded to you 100 times, she said quietly. He didn't even read the whole thing, just one glance at the photo. The angle that made it clear someone had been watching them. And the bile rose in his throat. He'd lived with this kind of intrusion for years. But Fina, she hadn't chosen it. She hadn't been prepared. Shut it down, he told Lydia. We can try to get them to pull the photo, but other outlets do it anyway. The meeting blurred after that. Numbers, projections, voices, all of it slid past him. All he could think about was calling her. But what would he even say? Surprise. I'm a CEO millionaire who just got you dragged into my mess. That evening, he typed, we need to talk. Call me when you can. She didn't answer right away. Hours passed. It was almost 10 o'clock when his phone finally lit up with her name. I saw it, she said. No hello, no small talk. Fina. Is that really who you are? He closed his eyes. Yes. My name is Eric Baffer. I run Baffer Industries. Silence. He thought maybe she hung up. But then she spoke again. You could have told me. I didn't want that to be the first thing you knew about me. And yet, it's the first thing the rest of the city knows. Her voice wasn't angry, not exactly. It was something heavier, something that felt like disappointment pressed into every word. Can we talk in person? He asked. I have an early shift. I'll meet you after. She didn't agree, but she didn't hang up either. The next day, he was outside the cafe when she stepped out, pulling her coat tighter around her. Her expression was unreadable, but her pace was brisk, almost defensive. You lied, she said simply. I omitted, he countered. There's a difference. Not to me. Did you think I wouldn't recognize your name eventually? Or did you assume I never read the news? I assumed, he said slowly, that if you knew from the start, you might treat me differently, and I didn't want that. She folded her arms, the cold air catching in her breath. I didn't treat you differently when you were just Eric who runs a company. Maybe that's why this hurts, because you didn't give me the chance to prove it. You've seen what people say about me, he said, the stories they twist. I didn't want you dragged into that, and now here I am anyway, she replied. For a moment neither spoke. The city moved around them, cars hissing through the slush, a bus brake squealing at the corner. I can protect you from this, he said finally. That's not the point, she answered. I don't want to be someone you protect like I'm a liability. I want to be someone you trust enough to tell the truth to from the start. Her eyes held his for just a moment longer before she stepped back. I need time. He didn't follow when she turned away. He just watched until she disappeared into the crowd, the cold biting a little sharper than before. The days without her felt longer than they should have. Eric had lived through worse silences, deals falling through, friends disappearing when fortunes shifted, entire months where the only voices in his life belonged to employees reading off numbers. But this was different. This was quiet in all the wrong places. On the fourth morning, without a single message from her, he stopped pretending he was waiting. If she wasn't going to reach out, he would. But he knew it couldn't be with another half-measure apology. She had told him exactly what she needed. Truth, and the choice to be part of his world without him deciding for her. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. By noon, his schedule was already stacked with back-to-back meetings, calls with overseas partners, and a dinner with a board member he'd been avoiding for weeks. He pushed it all away with a single sentence to Lydia. Clear my afternoon. Everything. Her eyebrows rose. Everything. Everything. And call the community art studio. Tell them I need it tonight. Private. She didn't ask why. Lydia never asked. That evening, the studio didn't look quite like the space Fina had walked into before. The mismatched chairs and scattered easels had been rearranged into an open, warm-lit room. Strings of bulbs hung across the ceiling, casting a soft glow over a row of blank canvases against one wall. Each had a set of brushes and fresh paints beside it. In the center stood a small table with 2 mugs and a plate of shortbread cookies. It was simple. It was deliberate. It was for her. Eric checked his phone again. The only message he'd sent was hours ago. I have something to tell you. Please meet me at the studio. If you don't want to, I'll understand. The door opened just as he began to think she wouldn't come. She stepped inside in her denim jacket and scarf, her hair a little mussed from the wind. This isn't coffee, she said, glancing around. No, he replied. It's a place where I don't have to be Eric Baylor, CEO, just Eric. The same way you're just fine here, not someone the internet gets to define. She didn't move closer. You set this up for me. I set it up for us. He said. She folded her arms, her expression guarded. Why? Because I need you to know that when I kept my name from you, it wasn't because I thought you'd want me for it. It was because I wanted to hold on to the way you looked at me in that restaurant. Like I was worth seeing even if you didn't know why. I've never had that before. Her gaze didn't soften right away. He took a breath and continued. You once told me survival wins over hobbies. That night I realized I've been surviving too. In boardrooms, at galas, in rooms where I'm expected to play a part. But with you, I don't feel like I'm acting. I want to be in your world the same way you were in mine from the first moment. Without conditions. Fina's fingers tightened on the strap of her bag. You don't get to control how people see you in my world either. I know, he said, but I'm willing to risk it if it means standing there with you. Silence stretched between them, warm and brittle all at once. Then she stepped forward, brushing her hand over one of the brushes on the nearest easel. So what's this? Paint your own apology. His mouth curved faintly. Something like that. They stood at separate easels, dipping brushes into color. At first they painted in silence, the scratch of bristles on canvas the only sound. Slowly the tension eased. She began talking about the first mural she ever painted. A huge sunflower scene on her aunt's garage. He told her about the one Saturday his father had spent teaching him to mix paints, insisting business and art weren't so different after all. When they stepped back, neither of their paintings looked like much, but both of them were smiling. I still don't know if your world and mine can fit together, she said, setting her brush down. Then let's build a new one. Eric replied, one where no one gets to decide who belongs except us. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she nodded just once. I'm not promising forever. I'm promising today. I'll take today, he said. They sat at the table, the months warm between their hands, the quiet between them softer now. When they finally stepped outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the sidewalk in a thin white layer. They walked side by side until their hands brushed once, then again. And without looking at each other, their fingers laced together. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a start. The first days after that night in the studio felt different. It wasn't a grand transformation. They didn't suddenly start living in each other's pockets. And there were still silences, still moments where both seemed to be measuring how much to give. But something had shifted. Eric began appearing in places Fina didn't expect him. Once he stopped by the cafe near the end of her shift, taking a seat in the corner booth while she finished wiping down tables. He didn't interrupt, didn't pull her away from her work, just sat with a book in hand, looking up every so often with the kind of smile that felt like a secret meant only for her. Another time she spotted him at the street market she visited on her one day off. He was hopeless with the produce vendors, letting an elderly woman talk him into buying more tomatoes than any one man should need. She helped him carry them back to his car, laughing the entire way. The tension from their earlier weeks thinning just a little more. They didn't talk much about his world, not yet. Eric kept the conversations focused on the present, asking about her mother's recovery after a bad flare-up with her knee, listening to her stories about late-night delivery runs in the snow, letting her vent about customers who thought leaving coins was an acceptable tip. Fina, for her part, avoided asking too many questions about Baffer Industries. She wasn't ready to see that side of him, the part that lived under headlines and boardroom lights. She wanted to know the Eric who drank his coffee too hot, who still remembered the names of the people at the art studio, who could admit that he didn't know how to cook anything more complicated than scrambled eggs. One evening, after she'd finished a long double shift, she found him waiting outside the cafe. The wind was biting, the street lamps casting halos on the wet pavement. You're freezing, he said, taking in her hands. You're observant. She shot back, but there was no edge in it. He pulled a scarf from his coat pocket and draped it around her neck before she could protest. It's clean, I promise. They walked without much of a destination, their steps eventually leading to a quiet riverside park. The river was dark, reflecting the sparse city lights, and their breath hung in the air between them. This place used to be packed in summer, she said, watching the water. Families, music, kids chasing each other. Winter makes it lonely. Not tonight, he said simply. She glanced at him then, her eyes catching on the earnestness in his expression. It wasn't a line and it wasn't calculated. He was just there with her. It was easy to forget the gap between them when it was like this. Eric, she began hesitating. If someone asked you why you're here, why you keep showing up, what would you say? He took a moment before answering. Because you make me forget I'm supposed to be someone else all the time. Her chest tightened and she looked away before he could see too much in her eyes. A few days later, the gap between their worlds pushed its way back in. It was small at first, a comment from one of his acquaintances when they ran into each other outside a bakery. The man looked Fina over and smiled in that way that wasn't quite kind. "Eric, you've been keeping this one a secret." She didn't know if the man meant anything by it, but the way Eric's jaw tensed told her he'd noticed. He brushed it off, changing the subject quickly, but the moment stayed with her. That night, lying in bed, she realized she was already in deeper than she'd planned. The $15 she'd earned from Maya felt like a relic from a different life, one that seemed further away with every step she took toward him. But she also knew something else. She couldn't keep that truth from him forever. And when she told him, she had no idea whether he would still be willing to stand in this in-between space with her. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of winter day where the sky felt too heavy for light to break through. Fina had been carrying it for days, the truth, the weight of that first night, the absurd little sum of money that had brought her to his table. She found him at the art studio. He texted earlier saying he was dropping off supplies. The place was empty when she walked in, the smell of fresh paint clinging to the air. He was crouched by one of the easels, unpacking brushes. "Eric," she said, her voice catching enough to make him look up immediately. "Hey," he said, smiling. "Wasn't expecting. I need to tell you something." The smile faded, replaced by a quiet attentiveness that made it harder to speak. "That night at La Veranda, I didn't just happen to be there. Maya, the woman you were meeting, she paid me $15 to disrupt your date. Give her a reason to leave." The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint creak of the building's heating pipes. "So, you were paid to sabotage your evening," she finished for him, her hands twisting together. "It was supposed to be nothing, just a stupid, harmless thing. And then you asked me to sit down," and she shook her head. "Everything that happened after was real, all of it. I never thought I'd see you again. Let alone end up here," he said quietly. She nodded, swallowing hard. "I should have told you sooner, but I was afraid the only thing you'd see was the $15, not the person who." Her voice faltered, but she forced herself to keep going. "Not the person who cares about you now." Eric didn't speak right away. He set down the brush he'd been holding, leaning back against the table. "You know, I've had people try to get close to me for far more than $15. Companies, investors, people I thought were friends, and they all had a number in mind. It just wasn't as small as that." Her chest tightened. "So you're saying this ruins everything?" He shook his head slowly. "I'm saying it doesn't. Not if we decide it doesn't." She blinked, unsure she'd heard him right. "Why?" "Because," he said, stepping closer, "the moment you sat down that night, I forgot about the reason you were there. And every moment since has been about you, not about how it started." Her eyes burned in the way that meant tears were coming, but she managed a small laugh. "You realize that makes those the most expensive $15 of my life." He smiled, that real unguarded smile she'd seen only a few times. "Worth every cent." They spent the rest of the afternoon in the studio. She painted a little. He pretended to try before giving up and just watching her. The quiet between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was easy, like the sound of rain on a window you didn't need to close. When they finally left, the snow was falling again, soft and slow. They walked without talking, the street empty except for them. At the corner where they would normally part ways, Eric stopped. He took her hand, threading his fingers through hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. "No promises about forever," she said softly, almost echoing her words from the studio weeks ago. "I know," he said. "Just today." She nodded, and they started walking again, their joined hands swinging lightly between them. And for the first time since that strange rain-soaked night at La Veranda, neither of them was thinking about how it had begun. They were too busy living what had come after. Winter melted slowly into spring, and with it, the rhythm between them found its own quiet balance. They didn't rush. There were no whirlwind declarations or grand gestures for the world to see. Instead, there were Saturday mornings at the market where Fina would haggle with vendors while Eric carried bags that were always fuller than they'd planned. There were evenings when she brought takeout to his apartment, refusing to let him fuss over her in the gleaming kitchen he barely used. They would eat at the counter, talking about nothing and everything, her laughter echoing off the tall windows. Sometimes he joined her on her delivery runs just to keep her company. She would tease him about being overdressed for the job, but secretly she loved the way he leaned into her world without trying to change it. And on days when his own schedule became too much, she would bring him coffee to his office. Not the expensive kind his assistants ordered, but the cheap, strong brew from the cafe where she worked. They still had differences, they still disagreed, but when it came down to it, both of them knew they'd chosen to stand in the middle. Not in his world or hers, but somewhere they'd built together. And sometimes on quiet nights when the city outside was nothing more than a blur of lights, Fina would think about that first evening at La Veranda, the $15 in her pocket, and how it had somehow led her here. Eric never asked for the whole 15 back, but once months later, he did slip a folded 20 into her coat pocket with a note that read, "For our first date, I think I still owe you change." She never spent it.